Welcome everyone to our program this evening. My name is Joan Balk. I'm one of the adult programming librarians with the St. Mary's County Library in Leonardtown. We're down in St. Mary's County for those of you who are up in Pennsylvania. I got to thinking I've never really told you where our library is. So tonight, we're way down at the tip of Southern Maryland almost. So that gives you kind of an idea of where we are. But tonight, I'm going to welcome Jim Gibb. He is a professional archaeologist. Every time I say how long he's been in practice, I get it wrong. So tonight, I'm not going to even bring it up. Anyway, he knows his stuff. Tonight, he will be talking to us about one-room schoolhouses in Maryland. And I always get this messed up, so I always have to read this. He currently serves as the director of the Smithsonian Environmental Archaeology Laboratory at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Annapolis. And Jim is joining us from his home in Annapolis this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jim. The other thing I'd like to let everybody know is during the program, we love to see your faces. So you feel free to keep your video on. If you're more comfortable, turn your audio off. Jim loves to answer questions. So if during the program you have a question that you want to ask while he's talking, just say, excuse me, and hop right on in there and ask your question. So there you go, Jim. You've got the floor.
Okay, sort of. Thank you. Before we begin, I have a couple of announcements that Craig asked me to make. First of all, on September 17th, the Archaeological Society of Maryland is holding its annual workshop. It would have been held, I think, in March or April, but for obvious reasons was postponed. But we are going to have it in person in Crownsville. Should be a good time. It's a day of various sorts of talks on archaeology. You'll love it. Also in October, on the 23rd, the Archaeological Society of Maryland has its annual meeting. It will be held at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And so we'll be offering tours. I think there'll be 3 lectures, but we'll have tours and we'll probably make some sort of arrangement for lunch and everything. So hope you can attend. For both of these events, there's a small fee. It's probably around $6 or $7. I don't recall. And finally, the MAC Lab in central Calvert County is accepting volunteers beginning in October. That's what I hear. For those of you who have not been there, it's a magnificent facility. It's a wonderful staff. And my guess is they're going to have some really neat stuff to work on. They've been working on a 17th, early 18th century plantation site for a few years now. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the work will be dealing with those artifacts. Anyway, okay, that's enough for announcements. So, I'm going to be talking about one-room schoolhouses. For those of you who are interested, there is a published paper on this. It's in an academic journal, so it's meant for our fellow wizards, not really for public, but I think it's readable. And if you'd like a digital copy of it, please contact me or Joan, and we'll see that you get a copy. I'll also be talking a little bit about the archaeology of schoolhouses done in Michigan by a friend and co-author of mine, April Besaw. I do have a copy of her paper. It's been published in an international journal, so we can perhaps get that to you as well. So anyway, I'm talking about schoolhouses. Let's see if I can make this advance. Oh, one of my consultants. This is what most people think of as your typical one-room schoolhouse, a little red schoolhouse with a steeple on top where there'd be a bell, and they're painted red, which was a common color for most outbuildings in the 19th century. And there was certainly lots of these, lots of schoolhouses look more or less like this all over the country. But they didn't all look like that. There's actually a great deal of variability in schoolhouse design, furnishing, setting, the means of teaching. So that's what I really want to look at this evening. So we've got this schoolhouse in Talbot County, Maryland. It's still there. It's not far from Easton. You can certainly visit it. And it's worth a visit just realize that it's not a typical schoolhouse. It's one of many different types.
Jim, where did you say that was in Easton?
It's just outside of Easton. It's kind of northwest of Easton. I think it might be the road that leads to St. Michael's. I couldn't tell you right offhand, but it's not far. It's 10, 20 minutes outside of Easton. Okay. So three things I want to look at tonight are differences among schoolhouses, and this is both the architecture and the furnishings. What the significance of that variability is for teaching, for pedagogy, and also significance for local history. The point I want to make, and I'll make again at the end, is that because schoolhouses, they're probably the most common public building on the American landscape in the 19th century. More common than churches, more common in, well, any kind of public building you can think of. There's a lot of variability. If you have a schoolhouse and you preserve it, that's lovely. But that schoolhouse shouldn't stand for all of the other schoolhouses in the area. Preserving one doesn't mean you can go ahead and destroy the others because they're different, and those differences are important historically. So I'll hit on that at the end this evening. School history, actually, public school history varies a lot around the country. In the New England and the Northeast, the upper Midwest, public education started early in the 19th century. The New England was always, and the Northeastern states, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, were always very literate, and partly comes from the strong religious motivation for colonizing that part of North America. And so education was very important because you need to be able to read the Bible, if for no other reason. The southern states and some of the western states went through pretty much the same trajectory, but a couple of decades later. So when I talk about Maryland, I'm talking about the public history, the school history unique to Maryland. It's not the same as you go south, and it's not the same as you go north and west. We had attempts at developing a public school system earlier than the 1865, pretty much the 1850s. But in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, we had a new constitution, and that constitution included public education, free public education. So the public school history that I'm going to talk about in Maryland really begins in 1865. Schools for African-American children, about a decade later, always poorly funded. And it really is a subject in and of itself. So I'm not going to talk a lot about African-American school history. It's an interesting and complex story in and of itself. Mandatory education in Maryland began in 1919. Up until then, parents could choose to send their kids to school or not. After beginning with 1919, it was the law. Now, that doesn't mean everybody complied with the law, but it was the law. The development of school buildings in Maryland wasn't just out of the blue. There were publications on how to build a school and how construction addressed various sorts of issues like light and ventilation, sanitation, to a certain extent, keeping boys and girls apart. So there were a number of publications, but the most influential were by a New Englander named Henry Barnard. And I think his books are available in reprint, or you could at least download them from the web. But he wrote a series of articles on improving schoolhouse designs, which he eventually compiled into a single book in, I think, the 1840s, as I recall. I don't know if there's a publication date on this thing here. Oh, there it is, 1850. So you can get this online, but it talks about all kinds of designs for buildings and specifically the kinds of issues that the design was supposed to address. Let's see if I can. Keep having trouble advancing. Here's an example. I mean, like I said, we had schools before 1865. A lot of them were private schools that you had to pay tuition. For instance, the schoolhouse in the upper right-hand corner, Anne Arundel County, that's a little bit west of Annapolis. It's run by a retired school teachers organization, but it wasn't really a public. It was a private school. You had to pay tuition. Building's still there. They do tours of it. It's a museum. The one in the upper left-hand corner is in Harford County near Darlington. It's still there. It's on private property. It's a 6-sided schoolhouse, a hexagonal schoolhouse. Again, I think meant for private education. And then you see the other two, sort of a temple type affair, but this is out of a book and not necessarily something that actually existed. And then we have an octagonal schoolhouse in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Just to give you a sense of what's out there prior to 1865. There we go. These schoolhouses are more typical of 1865 and later. Oh, I have it up there pre-1865. It's actually post-1865. If you look carefully, you could see the common design, which is a simple rectangle. On the long walls on each side are 2 or 3 windows providing light, which is really important for the students. There's not much in the way of ventilation addressed in this other than those windows. And more often than not, there's an addition on the front of the building, single door through which the students enter. Now, the first photograph I showed you from near Easton, it had 2 doors, one for boys, one for girls. That sets it apart from a lot of these schools. Most of them, because they weren't well-funded or inexpensive buildings, they had just a single entrance. And the building wouldn't be that large anyway. We realistically keep boys and girls apart. But the one in the lower left-hand corner is in Seneca, Maryland, and it's built out of Seneca sandstone. The other one just next to it in Anne Arundel County, it's a frame building, pretty typical. The one in the upper right-hand corner, Charles County, it's import tobacco, a simple frame building, and probably pretty typical of most of the school buildings in Maryland. And the one up in Hereford County is built of stone, which was quite available around. It has since been converted into a house. And for those school buildings that survive, most of them survive because they were adaptively reused, generally as houses. Again, you see our Easton example in the upper left-hand corner. In Searfoss, which is a little bit northwest of Hagerstown, we have a 4-room school building built of brick. So that's later, I think that was 1890s, if memory serves. In the lower left-hand corner is a modified Rosenwald School for African-American children, just in Galesville, south of Annapolis. And then the Patapsco Female Institute, which was a private school opened in 1837. It's been gutted, but it's been stabilized and is a county park just in Ellicott City. It looks like a temple upon the hill, and that's no accident. Greek style, not right on top of the hill, but just slightly below the top, so you can really see the full exposure of the building. It was very impressive. But that was a school just for girls, the Patapsco Female Institute. So in terms of interior variability, we've got ventilation, mostly through windows. They didn't do much in the way of other kind of ventilation systems in the 19th and early 20th century. We can look at desks and also the entrances, the cloakrooms, where children would put their outerwear and also their lunch boxes. And we'll see an example of one of those lunch boxes, courtesy of Kent Slavin, towards the end. So here we have a publication. I don't recall, I think this might be from Barnard's book, but you can see the general plan of these things. You've got these rows and rows of desks, and I don't know if you could see my cursor. I hate to use the special cursor because it affects my ability to advance slides. But in the upper left-hand corner, you have those rows of desks, and up front is a stand for the teacher, elevated. And that's a pretty typical design that we see in these schoolhouses. But remember, we had the little hexagonal and these octagonal schoolhouses. Obviously, you couldn't arrange desks the same way. And how you arrange those desks around the teacher and how you separate desks and benches for different parts of the student body doing different activities at the same time. All that says something about teaching methods of the time and for each individual place where we find these schools. So there is a classic example of what these things look like. You will also have a rear room. Sometimes, most of these schools had privies in the back, one for boys, one for girls, often separated by a fuel shed with wood or coal, depending on what they were heating with. But not all, I'll be talking a little bit about source of archival information on individual schoolhouses in a bit, but not all schoolhouses had privies. Not all schoolhouses had wells for water. And how individual schools dealt with that, I am not sure. In some cases, they used a neighbor's well, but what did they do for privies? As we get into the 20th century, more and more schools started adapting their schoolhouses and using chemical toilets. So they were indoor, sort of like a porta-john, except in the building. This schoolhouse design here, sorry, it's a little blurry, but I got some of these images some years ago, and trying to get a decent image was often a challenge. But this schoolhouse, one-floor schoolhouse, was designed for 120 students. One-room school, 120 students. Clearly, that required special adaptation of teaching methods and rearranging desks or having tables, separate spaces. I sure wouldn't want to have taught in a schoolhouse like that. It must have been a hell of a challenge. In 1865, Maryland established the first superintendent of schools. And the first superintendent of schools was a guy with the unlikely name of Libertus von Boekelen. Hardly anybody's ever heard of him, although there's one school in Anne Arundel County named after him. But he sort of rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, insisting on certain designs for schools, among other things. In his first report of the Board of Education, it's a lengthy volume, and he included these images of what schoolhouses should look like. And using a time-honored technique of leveraging with funds, he said, if you want state funds to build your schoolhouse, you will build it along one of 5 different designs. And these are those 5 different designs. And if you look at them carefully, you realize there's really only one design there. Yeah, you've got your basic school building, you have the entranceway, and it's largely a question of how big will it be and whether you will use brick or stone or frame. And he insisted, you want money, you have to build along these designs. He also had all kinds of stipulations about furnishings and teaching methods and whatnot. He lasted, I think, about 2.5 years, and then the legislature decided to abolish his position. But the Board of Education continued with public education. Soon thereafter, they reestablished the position of superintendent of schools. And the superintendent also was the head of the normal school, the state normal school, which is a normal school is where you teach teachers, which was up at College Park. So the person who was president of the normal school was also the state superintendent of education. Here's an interior of the schoolhouse up at Valley Forge. Again, I apologize for the quality of the image. It's somewhat old, and I did the best I could. But you could see in the center, we have the teacher's desk elevated, the schoolmaster's desk. We have benches along each side, right along the windows, so you get light and ventilation. And then you get benches in the center where the teacher could tutor small groups of students. Students could do their recitations while the other students worked at their own work at the desk alongside the windows. It's early 20th century, maybe late, early 20th century photograph of the school interior. And you could see that enormous blackboard in the background. Again, teacher's desk up here. And if you can make it out, there's 2 benches here where students would sit when being tutored by the teacher, and everybody else would be sitting back at their desks. If you'll notice really carefully too, over in one corner, we've got smaller desks. All the desks are not the same size because it's a one-room schoolhouse. So you've got students of different ages. And if they're different ages, generally they're of different sizes too. So it was important for a school, a one-room schoolhouse, to have desks of different sizes. Now, most school districts were quite cheap or impoverished or whatever, and couldn't go out and buy desks all the time. So whatever desks were in the room had to accommodate the student population at the time. So you can imagine some people, I'm 7 foot high and 300 pounds, and I'm not going to fit in one of those little desks, right? And then you'd have some little tiny kids sitting in a big desk. So these schoolrooms weren't terribly adaptable in that respect. I mentioned a few minutes ago archival sources for Maryland schools. Beginning in 1865, there is an annual report of the Board of Education. And I know one complete source of these reports is at the State Law Library in Annapolis. It's just across Rao Boulevard from the Maryland State Archives. So I don't know what things are like during the plague year, but I think I always used to just walk into the Court of Appeals building. The library is right there in front of you. You go in, try to get some help finding this, but there's several shelf feet of reports, annual reports. And for the years 1865 to 1919, those reports are broken down by county and by school. You can actually get detailed information on individual schools. All you need to know is what district that school is and what number the school was given. So here's an example, and it's a little weird because the map on the left is actually Anne Arundel County, and the report I have on the right is from Talbot County, but it'll do. This is, I think, 1878 map of Anne Arundel County, and you can see right in the center it's school number 9, and you can see part of second here. So it's second district, school number 9. So this school would be referred to as School 9, District 2. In the summary for each report has a summary for the county, the number of schools, the number of teachers, what grades they're teaching, what the attendance is, what the enrollment is, and there's usually quite a difference between the two. After 1873 or so, they start including colored or African-American students as well who'd have their own schools. If you turn the page on that particular report, you get a list. Again, it's by the number of the school and the election district, who the teacher is, and the enrollment and attendance for each of the 4 terms of school. Often you get, how much rent is paid, how much do they spend on fuel. Unfortunately, they don't tell us whether it's wood or coal. How much they spend on repairs, all sorts of financial information. And often at the beginning of the report, they'll tell you what school was built that year and what it was built of and how big it was. Some of the reports give extensive list of the books that were available in each school. So this is a great resource, and I'm sure there are other sources. I would imagine somewhere in St. Mary's County, there's a full set. But you really want 1865 through 1919. After 1919, there's the school population, especially with mandatory education, is so large that they just, they get rid of all the detail. We no longer have that detail. It's really useful for researchers. Just want to show you a couple of the schools to give you some sense of variability with African-American schools. This is in Drayton, which is in St. Mary's County. It's not sure it's on the way to anywhere. I think it's the kind of southwestern St. Mary's County. But the building has, I think, been restored, and there's certainly some signage in front of it today. This is an historic photograph of it, taken in 1994 by one Elizabeth Hughes, who's now our State Historic Preservation Officer. She's recorded a number of schools, so if you're interested in preserving schools, we have somebody in a position of authority who could be very helpful. Another African-American school in St. Mary's County, this is the so-called Able Colored School, built sometime around 1890. I don't know when it ceased operation. It's interesting. You can see it's got 2 chimney stacks. So these would have served cold, sort of parlor stoves, if you will, which was the typical way of heating most of these school buildings, which meant if your seat was close to the stove, you were nice and warm during the winter. If you were in the back of the room, you were cold. Circulation was not great. Another St. Mary's County example, recorded by George McDaniel, who is a fabulous historian who wrote a book called Hearth and Home on his research, mostly in St. Mary's and Calvert counties, on African-American life. Really good book, but the Maryland Historical Trust, their records are full of his contributions. He took this in 1977, Milestown, which I think is in the Able area. And this one down in Scotland, which is going down towards Point, obviously converted into a commercial building, but this is a pretty typical schoolhouse, and particularly an African-American schoolhouse, inexpensively built and generally with lots of deferred maintenance, 1878 to approximately 1948. And this one also taken by Elizabeth Hughes, the Phyllis Wheatley School, named for the African-American poet, 1878 to 1951, a very different design, which has obviously been adaptively reused as a house. So this porch on the front, I suspect, isn't original, and this addition on the side probably isn't original either. But still, a hip roof. I'm not sure, but I've not seen this design before, actually. And this one, which is more typical of 1865 to say 1920 one-room schoolhouses, overgrown. I'm not sure it's still there anymore. St. Inigo's Colored School, first half of the 20th century. And you can't see it. It's got raised seam metal roof. It probably has a chimney back here. That might be it there for the coal stove. So for African-American schools, again, I think beginning probably around 1873, 1875, at the end of each county report, in the annual report from the Board of Education, they would have the statistics on colored schools in the county. And again, they're organized by school and district, names the teachers, provides information on enrollment, attendance, and the various costs of running the school.
Jim, have you seen the one in Ellicott City that was reconstructed?
The African-American school?
Yes.
Yeah, it's been restored. I don't think it's been reconstructed. It's been restored.
Oh, right,
a number of years ago. Archaeologist, Elizabeth Comer did some archaeology there before they did the restoration. I've actually given a lecture in that room some years ago. It's an interesting site. I wish I had a photograph to show you because it is really hard to get to. It's up this steep hill. I mean, there's hardly any place to park, and you can just imagine the students hauling their butts up that hill to get to that schoolhouse, and there's very little flat land around it for a playground. But it's kind of typical, the worst possible land.
There's a picture.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure we're going to be able to see it very well. It looks nice enough, especially restored to go in. It's a beautiful job. Yeah. But I think, yeah, you have to approach these things critically. When you go look at it, you go, well, how did they get up to that building? And where did they play? And it's clearly the cheapest possible land that could be gotten by the county on which to build that schoolhouse. So it is an interesting example. Okay, I want to talk now about a schoolhouse near Ellicott City that we did do some archaeology on. And the archaeology is fairly minimal, but it was an interesting study because it was the first time, I think, that archaeologists actually approached a one-room schoolhouse seriously, as if we might actually learn something from it. In the publication I mentioned at the beginning, I list, I don't know, 10 or 12 schoolhouse archaeology projects for which we have reports around the northeastern United States. And every single one of those sites were written off as having no archaeological potential because they dig shovel test pits around them, they wouldn't find any artifacts. Well, it's a schoolyard. What are you going to find? The place to dig, if you want to find artifacts, would be around the school foundation and under the school. But we'll get into that. Anyway, April Besaw and I did this, I don't remember how many years ago, probably around 2001 or so. Whoops. There we go. So here we have an 1878 map. And these maps, we don't really have any for St. Mary's County or Calvert County or Charles County. There's three real deep southern Maryland counties generally didn't have the resources to make it worthwhile to do one of these subscription maps where people would buy a subscription to the map and the map company would make it, put their names on it. But for a lot of other counties in Maryland, we have these maps and they put school buildings on it. And that's what this, and usually in this case, it's just SCH for school, a little 1 acre, probably 1 acre plot here, a little dot in the middle, that's the schoolhouse. Some of them actually give you the school number so you can get to the archival record. But this is just outside of Ellicott City in Owella, which was a mill town. A lot of the mill buildings are still there, a lot of the mill housing is there. If you go to Ellicott City, just I think it's Westchester Avenue or whatever, just drive uphill and there's a very narrow road, but it will take you up into Owella, which is really a charming little place with restored textile mills. At any rate, this is April right here doing some documentation, and she's sitting on one of the walls, foundation walls of the schoolhouse. This is what was there when we got there. Basically, it's just rubble, and people have been cannibalizing building stone from it for years. So it wasn't necessarily an intact site. And the reason we were there is because this guy, Charles Wygant, who has done a tremendous amount for historic preservation, particularly in Owella, he's a descendant of the Dickey family that owned the whole mill town. And he wanted to, as I recall, he wanted to build a house on this site and reuse the stone, and that's why we were there doing archaeology before that demolition occurred. He died several years ago. I'm not sure exactly when. And this is the sort of thing we were documenting, mostly through mapping. You see the brick here. That's the base of a chimney, just a chimney stack, not a fireplace. So that tells us right off these people heated this building with a wood stove, a sort of potbelly stove or parlor stove. You can see we've got a wall here. That's my trowel. We got another wall here. You can see that this wall abuts this one, and that suggests that this wall is part of an addition to the original building, and indeed, the building had been expanded. We've got, this is a digital reconstruction of what we found over here, but this is like essentially a clay pot of red earthenware, never glazed, and the bottom was cut off. And these things were manufactured. They're called thimbles. They're chimney thimbles. And it would be inserted into the chimney stack, and then the metal stovepipe would enter the chimney stack through that thimble. It was sort of an insulator. And so again, that's evidence that this was heated by one of these parlor stoves. We only dug 2 excavation units on this site. It was very poorly funded. I think we did all the archaeology for $5,000 or $6,000. But we got what we needed. I mean, you could see some ash in the soil here. This circular piece here is actually the lid to an ash can. You know, most of you are probably old enough to remember those metal garbage cans that we all used, right? So virtually everybody's garbage pail was made of metal, unlike plastic today. Well, an ash can was just a smaller trash can, and it was made specifically for putting ashes from a stove, whether it be a wood stove or a coal stove. And then you carted those ashes outside and dumped them somewhere. And so we actually have the lid to one of these things that gives us, gives you a little bit of a feel of what working in the schoolhouse was like. Somebody had to build a fire, tend the stove, clean the ashes out of the stove, and deposit them somewhere. No. I don't know what's wrong with the advance of this thing. So here's our map. This is actually I think my first attempt at creating a digital map using a digital drafting program. So it's a little crude, but there it is. We've got the essential foundation of the building with the vestibule, center wall that helps support the floorboards, the chimney base, so the chimney's over on this side. And then we have these walls that don't tie into, they just abut the original wall. This is clearly an addition. You see the topography here, 5 foot, 7 foot, 9 foot, 2 foot contours over a short distance. This is a fairly steep slope here. We have flatter ground over here, but this wouldn't have been much of a playground here. It's just too steep. We have a sewer line that went through the site, probably destroying part of it, but nothing terribly important. That's all we got for that. And here we have a picture of the building, a Willow School building dated 1925. It might have been a postcard, actually, postcard photograph. But here you could see the topography dropping off here. It's kind of high up here. Actually, it seems to be kind of steep over here too. Not much of a playground. It's interesting to look at this photograph carefully because you could see there should be a window in here. It's not. It looks like there's a hole in the door. This building is abandoned. And it was abandoned the year before. School closed down and all the students were sent off to a central school a little ways away at Westchester Avenue. This school succumbed to what we call centralization. Beginning in the 1920s, a lot of one-room schoolhouses were closed. We had motor vehicles that could take students to a larger central school where they could be taught more economically. They can have individual rooms for individual grades, teachers assigned to specific grades, possibly even vocational instructors, home economics instructors, etc. There are a lot of advantages to that, but there are some disadvantages too, in that these schoolhouses were the central parts of their community. These were where people congregated for 4th of July celebrations, commemorations, Memorial Day commemorations, ice cream socials. To a great extent, schoolhouses were central to their communities. And a lot of people did not look kindly on having them removed. There was a lot of conflict over that. So here's our plan of our schoolhouse here. It matches the photograph you see here, and you can compare it to one of Von Boekland's plans, number 5. This building was built of stone because, it's Ellicott City, they had lots of stone. But you can see the vestibule here and here, the main block is over here, and this addition with its own entryway, they're over here. As I recall, the main block of the building was supposed to accommodate 100 students. The addition and another 50 students, 150 children in this building. And you can look at the door here and get some sense of scale. That had to be one crowded place. Using the Board of Education records, we could plot for Willow School what its registration was, here marked in blue dashed line, and what the actual attendance, average daily attendance was. And you can see there was quite a difference between them. The numbers on the left are actually number of students. So here we got one year, a little over 100 students registered, but an average daily attendance of just over 40. That's not very good. But you can see that gap pertained through virtually the entire life of that school building. You can also see that when they expanded the building in 1897, that extension, the registrations rose, as did daily average attendance. So we can relate expansion, the building itself, and expansion to changing registration, enrollment, and attendance. Within the school building, we found these desk parts, and they're really kind of rusted. Actually, I have the whole collection, such as it is, from the site. That for some reason it wound up with me. It's never been passed on to the state. But this desk part is the same as this metal stand here for a desk that's actually over at that schoolhouse outside of Annapolis, the private school. That little museum there has a whole bunch of desks from different periods. Whoops. And here's a close-up of that desk. And again, this is exactly what we recovered from Oella. Patented March 31, 1863. August 1869, I guess is the manufacturing date. W. Horace Soper was the guy who patented this design. It's made in Baltimore, Maryland. First of all, if you read the text, you'll find something kind of ironic in it. No takers? Patented is spelt incorrectly. It's missing an N. The other interesting thing about it is the guy who patented, W. Horace Soper, he was secretary to the Superintendent of Education, Libertus von Boecklen. And so he patented this design, and in the annual report, von Boecklen promoted it. So, I mean, we would look askance at this today. I mean, we even in Maryland, we've had politicians lose their jobs for, I don't know, publishing a book and then getting the school district to buy it, kind of thing. But back then, I guess it was acceptable. So this was the secretary to the superintendent of schools that patented this. And we actually have, this is his patent, or part of it, the drawing from his patent. Patent records survive. They are available online. Researching material at the US Patent Office is a royal pain in the butt, but it is possible. And some of the stuff you could just Google online because people have downloaded it before and hoisted it up on the web. So you may not even have to go to the patent office for this. The second school I wanted to talk about where we did some archaeology, I didn't do any archaeology myself, was my colleague April Besaw. She's now at Vassar College, tenured. But for a couple of years, she was in Michigan, just outside of, what's the major university there? Drawing a blank. Big university town, though.
Are you talking about Lansing?
No.
University of Michigan in Ann Arbor?
Ann Arbor, thank you very much.
Okay.
Mine is going. This is a school building built in 1868. And you can see a photograph of it. It had been adaptively reused, I think, at this point. And this is what it looked like before it was moved to another site where it was going to be restored and used as a museum. This is one of those instances where, there was another schoolhouse just down the road. And this one was selected for preservation and the other was not. And yet these are two very different school buildings built about 10 years apart. One school building does not serve for all the others. There is variability, and understanding that variability is really important for getting at local history. Anyway, April was out there with a bunch of volunteers. They did some excavations, exposing foundations. Her map, which is even cruder than mine, but you can see there's a foundation. It was in worse condition than ours, I think. She only dug 3 excavation units, a bunch of shovel test pits, which we had done at Oella as well. And basically, they didn't, like us, they didn't find a lot outside of the school building. We found actually a coal ash pile at Oella. So it tells us what kind of fuel they're using, coal for fuel, and where they kept it. And presumably, if there were privies, they were probably right next to the fuel pile. Here she has, for some reason, decided up in this, in the upper left-hand corner was a privy area, and another one to the right of the school building. I haven't read a report lately. I don't recall why she thought those were places for privies. But you got a whole bunch of students there. You got to have some place to go, right? She found, again, part of a school desk. Unfortunately, there's no manufacturer or patent date on it, but clearly it's the kind of desk they had. What I really found interesting, she found 49 slate pencils. And she sent them to me for some analysis because, well, we didn't know anything about slate pencils. And I would imagine very few people do know about slate pencils. First of all, they're not slate. Slate is ground up and you add water, basically it's clay. And so slate pencils are actually a ceramic product. And so we looked at these things under magnification. And you can see several of them. They're different colors. They're sharpened in different ways. And here are some micrographs. Here's actually graphite pencil lead. You can see this is done your standard pencil sharpener, the rotary type that most of us used to have and which are now pretty much gone by the wayside. Here's a slate one that's been sharpened, and this one here too with a penknife. So some kid, this is some kid sharpening his or her pencil. This one in the upper right-hand corner is the butt end of the pencil. It's not the working end. And you can see some student took a penknife to it and scored around the end of it, presumably to tie a string around it. And that string would be tied, I presume, to a slate writing board. Writing slates were also a ceramic product. They weren't made directly from slate. And finally, with pencils, when we looked at them under the microscope, we could see two types. There's this one here. So it's a ceramic product, and they make a big, a flat plate, ceramic plate, which they, in this case, they used a saw, machine saw, and cut the slate into strips, which would be the pencils. In this case down below, the striations go the different way. And this isn't from a saw, this is from extrusion. This kind of slate pencil, the clay was extruded through a die, much for those of you, I don't know if they still make these anymore, but the Play-Doh machines, little plastic machines, you put a piece of clay in and push it down and it'll be extruded through some sort of pattern. Well, that's the way these pencils were made. So we have those that were cut from a ceramic plate, and we have those that were extruded as clay and then fired. What is the significance of these two different manufacturing techniques? We don't know. Maybe no significance at all. Maybe it just happens to be the way two different manufacturers made pencils. By the way, a little side note, one of the world's most famous pencil maker was a guy named Henry David Thoreau. For a while, I think in the early 1840s, this great naturalist and poet and such ran his father's pencil factory making graphite pencils, early 1840s. There is actually an interesting book on the pencil, a history of the pencil. It's actually quite an interesting book. You'd think it'd be boring as all hell, but it isn't. At the Blaze School, where April excavated outside of Ann Arbor, she recovered the remains of 3 ceramic inkwells. And I thought in some images of other inkwells. I think these might be Kent's. I think these might be from Kent's collection. Now, inkwells are really important. They're important because are students using pencils and slates, or are they using pen and ink and paper? Now, paper is expensive, so that says something right there. Slates, once you buy them, you just keep using them and using them. But another issue here is that whatever a student wrote on a slate would eventually be wiped off and something new would be written on. With paper, there's the potential for a student's writings to survive. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute or two, again from Kent's collection. So this transition to paper, and it isn't necessarily a transition. Some schools may have used pen and ink, some may have stuck with these slate, the pencil slates. But they tell us a lot about pedagogy, about the science of teaching and the practice of teaching students. And it tells us about something that might survive the history of a particular school, depending on whether they're writing in pencil or pen. This also might be from Kent's collection, I don't recall, but a quart-size ink bottle. Now, needless to say, this would be something the school teacher would have, presumably under lock and key. The last thing in the world you want lying around a schoolroom with a bunch of boisterous children is a quart bottle of ink. You're just looking for trouble. But bottles of ink could easily be ordered, mail ordered through Sears and Roebuck and Montgomery Ward, begin 1890s or so. But here the teacher would then go and dole out ink to students, thereby controlling how much was used and how much trouble they could really get into. The other thing April found at Blaze School, and which we've been finding at other school sites since we published this work some years ago, are medicine bottles. And the top one is for Hamburg drops, August Koenig's Hamburger Tropfen. And this is basically beef extract with alcohol in it. And I don't recall what the other pharmaceutical bottles are, but it looks like parents actually would bring medicines to the teacher that had to be administered during the day. And the student would administer a student's medicine. Now, in this day and age, a lot of those medicines are just alcohol-based. I'm not sure how useful they'd be anyway. They might have calmed the student down. But the idea that the Koenig's little medicine there was mostly the beef extract, which would be a nutrition supplement for students who had been ill and just returned back to school. So medicine bottles on schools, kind of an interesting idea too. We wouldn't see that today. Non-archaeological artifacts, thank you, Kent. Probably don't even recall me photographing this stuff years ago, but this is stuff from his family. Composition book. I don't think I have any pictures of the inside, but you know, it's his, what was it, your mom, I think.
Yeah, it's Idella H. Rife.
Yeah, was that your mother? And a first German book. This is really interesting for teaching German language. For a few years in the 1870s, the Maryland legislature made it legal to use school funds to hire a German teacher for schools that could produce, I don't know, 6 or 8 students to make it worth their while, just for a short period in the 1870s. And then they put an end to that. This is at a time when there was a lot of German immigration into Maryland. The fact that they put an end to it borders on tragic, because we missed out on teaching generations of students the German language. How helpful would that have been in 1917? How helpful would it have been in the years leading up to 1917, the First World War, to have more Americans able to communicate with Germans, to understand and be able to negotiate with them? I'm not saying there's a direct association between Maryland putting an end to German education and World War I. I am saying that there's value in the subjects we teach beyond the 3 R's, and particularly languages are really important. In high school, I studied Chinese. These are, Kent, I think this is your lunchbox, and we have,
at the school where my mom went, the teacher at Christmas would give gifts out to the students. And this was one, and this.
Those gifts are something that we don't even think about as archaeologists going to a site. But, you know, what if one of these is lost or broken? What about an ice cream social where people bring, you know, especially in the late 19th century, start bringing their fancy, not Lenox ware, but Haviland porcelain, and some of the stuff gets broken. And we could start seeing some of these social events represented at schoolhouses based on ceramics, and in some cases glass. But this idea of teachers giving these small, probably quite inexpensive gifts to students, especially those who performed well. Needless to say, I never got anything like that. So anyway, to kind of start wrapping all this up, you know, one of the questions that has persisted throughout the history of education, at least from the early 19th century and probably earlier, right up through today, is what's the goal of primary education? What are we trying to do? We know in the late 18th and early 19th century, people like Thomas Jefferson strongly advocated for education. They even wanted a national college because education, in their opinion, helped create good citizens. Citizens who could read, who can analyze, who can, you know, look at things critically, make informed choices, particularly at polling booth, and also just lobbying legislators. For a lot of educators, and I probably include myself to a great extent in this group, it's a way of inculcating ethical and intellectual values, teaching students at all ages, and even at the collegiate level, not facts, but how to think, and how to think ethically. Now, throughout our history of education, there's been this counterflow of folks who thought schools should teach practical skills. And that was largely the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, because those were important for commerce, basically. And it, by the late 19th century, more and more had to do with vocational training, teaching boys how to make things out of wood and metal, teaching girls home economics, teaching boys and girls gardening, cultivation, because a lot of them would be living on farms. And so there is this constant tension between what should we be teaching? Should education be literary and philosophical, or should it be very practical? And again, that continues to this day. In the early 20th century, we see more and more emphasis on African-American children basically learning a vocation, and white children being prepared for the professions. I mean, it's very, you can tell even just from the names of schools. There's one in Calvert County in Prince Frederick that was called, it was called a vocational school. It was intended for Black children. So we see that permeating throughout today, and we even see pictures of it. Here we have a bunch of students out there doing a garden outside your schoolhouse. Now, maybe that's good recreation, but on the other hand, should they be out gardening, or should they be studying Shakespeare and basic mathematics and civil society and stuff like that? That's the kind of tension that persisted throughout our educational history and still does. And the other major issue is, where's the locus of control? Who should control school districts? And man, you just have to turn on the television today, focus on places like Florida, and you could see this manifest today. Should decisions be made by local school boards who are responsible to local citizenry? Should they be made by state boards of education and the legislature? In this country, we have this concept called shared sovereignty. And it's a concept we applied initially to government. We have the federal government, the national government, and we have state governments. And to a large extent, they share control. Some things the federal government's in charge of, some things the state's involved in charge of, and then there's this kind of gray area in between where it's contested. Well, the same thing happens in schools. We have a local school board that's responsible, we have a state board of education that's responsible, and often there's friction between the two. Yes, local school boards can be more responsive to local needs and resources. On the other hand, states have had to step in from time to time, and even the federal government, to deal with issues of gender and race. Title IX for women, particularly in sports. Equal, separate by equal, U.S. Supreme Court saying that separating Black children from white children is not equal. If we left it up to local and state school boards of education, segregation, legal segregation would probably continue to this day. So there's this, it's necessary to have these two loci of control. On the other hand, we can expect that there will be persistent friction between different levels of government over schools. That's just the nature of the beast. I think this is my last slide, but this is the Westchester school outside. It's actually outside of Oella. It isn't a school anymore. I think it's a community center. It too has been supplanted by a bigger, more modern school. But this was built in 1924, and this is where the students who used to go to the Oella Schoolhouse were moved to. And again, with development of roads and widespread adoption of motor vehicles, it became possible to transport students longer distance to these central schools. think. Oh, I have final thoughts. Yeah, getting back to variation. Variation is really important, and it's something I talk about in a lot of the research I do. It's from variation that you get material for change. Different people do different things at the same time. Well, some of those practices end up becoming prominent over a period of time. And so that change has its roots in variability. There's a lot of variability in schools in terms of how they're built, how they address issues largely of ventilation and lighting and heating. How do you furnish? Are they desks, individual desks? Or are they paired desks with 2 students at one desk? Are they benches and tables? How do they go about seating children? That's going to have a great effect on how they're going to go about teaching people. What are they going to write with? Again, moving to paper and ink cost more money, certainly, although paper was getting quite cheap in the late 19th century. But it also is a way of preserving those students' writings, and it becomes source material for historians today. Whereas a writing slate, the next exercise you do, you have to erase the old one, and so nothing survives. And so my argument for schoolhouses all over the place, whether they're standing or they're just archaeological sites, is that we need to try to extract some information from many of them, because they allow us to look at the history of education in that particular community, the values that a community held at any one particular time, how much did it value education, how important was it? And also allows us to look at the history of pedagogy in the area. There are always people at the state level and outsiders, university folks, writing about how we should be teaching children. And a lot of these teachers, especially in the late 19th and 20th centuries, they went to teacher institutes every summer. A lot of them. They went off to some place in the state, maybe Ocean City or Easton, and spend weeks engaged in seminars, workshops, and teaching. So these people are informed. The question is, what did they actually do at their individual schools in their particular communities? Did they use the latest and greatest ideas? Did they reject them for something more traditional? Did they come up with their own brand? These are questions that we'd like to ask of any community in which we're doing this kind of work. Anyway, that I think is it. Yes, that is it. So I am happy to take questions. These are two of my earlier students, 2 of my better students. They're no longer with us though. So anyway, let me start.
I had a question about whether if most of the early teachers in Maryland were men, because I know that Horace Mann was a big proponent of women starting to teach, but in the 1840s or so. But I was curious whether you knew what was going on in Maryland.
Well, I haven't pulled together the statistics, or maybe I've done so and have forgotten. But yes, most of the earlier teachers in the 1860s and 1870s were men. Women rapidly supplanted them. I think for the sole reason that school boards can get them a lot cheaper. They paid them a lot less.
Were they forbidden to be married?
Yes, in most cases they were not supposed to be married. I never quite understood that. And if they didn't live locally, they boarded with a local family. That was part of their pay. But their rate of pay was considerable, and we know what they were paid. The data is there. They were paid considerably less than men for doing the exact same work. So it's a good question, and certainly I think some historians have looked into it, but it makes sense to look at it in terms of Maryland, and even the different parts of Maryland, which may have run things a little bit differently.
Well, guess what? In 150 plus years, things have not changed in terms of pay.
Teachers actually are getting paid a lot better than they used to get paid, relatively speaking.
Oh, yes, but women still make less than men do, is what I was saying.
Yeah, that I don't know about in the current teaching context, but they're still paid less than they should be, but conditions were far more abysmal 20, 30 years ago. But even now, we often see teachers who have to apply for public aid because they're not being paid enough.
Jim,
Yeah,
with,
I have a quick question, and that is, what is the name of the book that you mentioned about George McDaniels, the one pertaining to African American schools?
It's
What was the name?
called Hearth and Home. I
Okay.
think it was published in 1977. It's out of print, but I'm sure the local library has a copy. And I would imagine, in fact, I should do this myself. You could probably find copies online. It's a very good book. It doesn't focus on education. It focuses more on general African-American life in the Southern Maryland counties, pretty much post-Civil War. One of the things I haven't really talked about, other than the lack thereof, are privies. Privy holes would be very interesting to excavate on these school sites. We might find some very interesting things in the bottom, things that students either didn't want found or dropped in and really didn't want back that much. And we would guess there'd be 2 privies at each of these sites, one for boys, one for girls. But it'd be interesting to find if they're there. Do they have 2? Are they separated? Is there another one just for the teacher? Little things like that. It doesn't sound like much, but it really does inform on a history of these communities.
Jim, with so much variability in the design, especially before the 1865 timeframe that you mentioned, and then a lot of adaptive reuse of older school buildings, how do you determine whether something is actually a school building?
There's usually archival reference to it. Land records are a good place to just run back deeds, especially those, those schoolhouses that were public schoolhouses and weren't, some schoolmaster setting up, let's say in the 18th century and using his own house or a specially built building. We're talking about public buildings, so they're owned by the county or the county's Board of Education. So you could always just do a title search on a particular property where you see one of these buildings. And after this talk, everybody should be able to, driving down the road, to be able to spot one of these things.
Yeah.
So there's two warnings, though. One, that means there are people out on the road who might come to a dead stop in the middle of a travel lane because they see what they might think is a schoolhouse. So you got to be careful of that. Number 2 is.
Go ahead, finish.
Number 2 is there are a lot of small churches that are built the same way as the schoolhouses. Not an accident. The schoolhouses, to a certain extent, were probably modeled on small, rural New England churches. And so you will see buildings that may actually be a church rather than a schoolhouse, or it may be a schoolhouse that was turned into a church, or any number of other possibilities, but they're pretty typical.
Have you ever seen any that are more than 1 floor? Like really early ones, early 19th century.
No, I think I recall seeing some in maybe Henry Bernard or Horace Mann's publications. They might have referred to 2-room, but these are in kind of urban New England. No, they're almost invariably 1-story. Let's face it, if they're 2 stories, then they're not 1-room schoolhouses anymore. They're 2-room schoolhouses, and you need 2 teachers. But there's always a possibility for the unexpected. So one shouldn't rule out a possibility because it has 2 floors. The second floor might be an addition, or they would have a really oddball school, and it'd be really interesting to research it.
Jim, I've read a couple of historical fiction books about teachers up in Alaska and Canada, and they were women, and those schoolhouses always had the teachers' quarters, or a lot of the times the teachers' quarters were connected to the school. Do you find any of that in the lower states?
No, and I really wouldn't expect it either, because that's Alaska, where you've got a very dispersed population and lots of travel time involved. It might have made sense to house the teacher right next to the school, but to house unmarried woman by herself next to a school without a surrounding house, they want, for partly it's her protection, but probably more just kind how should I put this? Asserting her integrity. She's with a family, so all of her behavior is watched. She's not a floozy.
Right.
She's not drinking alcohol.
Right.
In the 19th century and early 20th century, alcohol use was a big thing, a big definite no-no, the sign of moral degradation. So, housing a woman with a family protected her reputation. Maybe that's also one of the reasons why they got away from men teachers is, because they're going to want to live on their own, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you got men living on their own and they're unmarried, you have no way of supervising them. Partly it's sex, I suppose. Mostly would have been alcohol, something that.
Mm-hmm. My
But,
other question, I don't know if anybody else is curious about this, but could you use a slate pencil to write on a slate board? Like, how did a slate pencil come across?
It works. You can see it. It's not quite as vivid as white chalk, but it worked fine. And
On a slate board.
Yeah, and then you wiped it clean because it's clay, so it's leaving particles on the hard surface of the slate.
Okay.
And then I've never actually cleaned one, but it's relatively easy to clean them off and write new stuff on it. I would imagine that surface gets kind of eroded, loses its sheen after a while, and probably got more and more difficult to erase. And you could probably see the sort of palimpsest of writings on it, as you can never quite get rid of the previous markings. And we see that with slate, with blackboards in our generation. You could see when they start wearing out and it becomes harder and harder to clean them.
Do you know when they started making chalk? I have no idea.
Oh, chalk's been around a long time, but that's not, as far as I know, it wasn't typically used by students, but used by the teachers. And all these school buildings where they survive, we do see blackboards. Even in that hexagonal schoolhouse in Harford County, there still remains of blackboards there. So teachers are using chalk on boards, certainly throughout the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th. As far as I know, students weren't using chalk.
Okay.
Jim,
Mhm.
when I signed my contract in 1972 to work in St. Mary's County, there was a clause in my teaching contract of moral turpitude. And it was explained to me is that whatever the local district thought was wrong, I could be fired for it.
Yeah.
So that still went on for a while. I don't know if it's still in there now, but that was in 72.
I wouldn't be surprised if you saw something along those lines, but I think they probably mean something different today. For instance, moral turpitude in 1973 might have been you were seen drinking at a local bar and maybe conversing with a young lady who you shouldn't have been conversing with. You could do that today. No one's going to fire you for that anywhere in Maryland I'm aware of. But there are things you can certainly do that would get you fired, that would come under the label of moral turpitude. But in fairness, that phrase was used in other employment contracts too that had nothing to do with education. I recall signing a contract for some employment many years ago that had something along those lines in it. But I think by the 1970s, that was beginning to disappear for most of us. They assumed we were immoral. What's the point? Any other questions? No? I'm speaking again next month. I can't for the life of me remember on what, but
I have it written down. Let's see.
it'll occur to me.
It is searching for Fort Hollingsworth.
Oh, War of 1812 stuff.
Yes.
Oh yeah, be there or be square.
Yeah. So I will send out, when I send out the follow-up email, I'll send out the registration link for that program.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Thank you.